subscribe for more videos like this.
Today we're reading F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So in lieu of that, close enough, we've got our Halloween layout that happens to have some, I guess, 20s type of people in the cars. And then some people up here with that kind of, I guess, 20s get up, jazz era and whatnot. The Dance of the Dead, to paraphrase Al Cervic and Caddyshack. Anyway, I'll be quiet for now, run trains, and then we'll read The Great Gatsby. Mayor Scott Fitzgerald's Not Be Effed. We're reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, but just chapter 1. And running some trains, of course, so you can relax. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in the world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also may be the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I had feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile lividity, when I realized by some unmistakable sign that his intimate revelation was quivering on that horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least in the terms for which they expressed them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments in a matter of infinite hope, I am still little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I came to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock of the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I was wanted in the world to be the uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with the privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with the flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I had never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family had been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we've descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, set a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great-uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to this rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New York Haven New Haven, rather, in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everyone I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could get support from one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if it were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently. I thought in the spring of 22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was warm season, and I had just left the country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went on to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He'd casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the youth, and young breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit, investment securities, and then stood on my shelf and read in gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back such things in my life because, again, that most limited of all specialists, that well-rounded man, that isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successful looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on the slender riotous island which extends itself east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be sourced of perpetual wonder to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particularity, except shape and size. I live at West Egg, the less favorable of the two, though this is more superficial as a tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, the tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over and had dinner with Tom Buchanan's. Daisy was my second cousin, once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I spent 2 days with him in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he's left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then they drifted here. And then they ran restfully wherever people played polo and rich together. There was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on the warm, windy evening I drove her to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing. You could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of frictiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even though two people he liked, and there were men in New Haven who hated his guts. I don't think my opinion of these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistful of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sun porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including it in a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound in the house by French windows at either side. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in one end and at the other like flag, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then ripped over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on the wind as it does the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed, as though they were anchored by balloons. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after the short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of the picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and wind died on about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing some on which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost as surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips, almost an exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that ears follow up and down, as if every speech an arrangement of notes that will be played never again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But that was excitement in her voice that men who would care for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done happy, exciting things just a while since then, and that there were happy, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent her love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate. All the cars had left Riverwell painting black as morning wreaths, and there's persistent with all nights along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she said, and added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bondman." "Who with?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if I stay in the East." "I'll stay in the East, don't worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if we were waiting for an alert for something more. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said absolutely with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned, and with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on the sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't look at me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you up to New York all afternoon." "No thanks," said Miss Barker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" He took down a drink as if it were a drop in the bottle of a glass. "How do you ever get everything done around here is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small woman with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards as it shouldered like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with pearlette reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. "You live in West Egg," she remarked contemptuously. "I knew somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though we were moving a checker to another square. Slendered languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out of the rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table from the diminished winds. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks, it won't be the longest day of the year." She looked at us radiantly. "Do you always wait for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it." "We'll have to plan something," yawned Miss Barker, sitting at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What'll we plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her finger. "Look," she complained. "I heard it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a—" "I hate the word hulking," objected Tom crossly. "Even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes, in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later in the evening, too, it would be, and casually put away.